Hi, it's Katrina. The Daxa Island Massacre. The Croatian island of Daxa is littered with the corpses of alleged Nazi sympathizers who were slaughtered following the end of World War II. The island itself is beautiful, steeped in ancient history. It's quite the picturesque place to spend a weekend. However, it's also allegedly haunted by the victims of the Daxa Massacre of 1944. It happened in the aftermath of World War II. With the Germans officially defeated, Nazis were hunted down. Just about every European country took it upon themselves to seek out every hiding Nazi they could find. It became an obsession, like a bunch of angry mobs hunting down Frankenstein's monster. In Croatia, this obsession grew into a frenzy, and on October 18, 1944, Yugoslavian authorities entered the Croatian city of Dubrovnik. They made hundreds of arrests, including the mayor and local priests. They arrested citizens whom they believed to be Nazi sympathizers. Days later, with no trial, the Yugoslavians rode to Daxa Island with their prisoners and executed every last one of them. The guilt of those executed has never been determined. In 2010, some of the bodies were given proper burials, but locals in Dubrovnik still claim the island is haunted. The island was up for sale recently, and the price tag was pretty low, yet there wasn't a single bid. Apparently, nobody wants to live on an island full of ghosts. The Lost Tomb of Cleopatra. The fabled lost tomb of the Egyptian queen Cleopatra may have once been on an island. At least that's one of the theories. Experts say Cleopatra was born in the city of Alexandria, right on the northern coast of Egypt. They also say that she ruled from a grand palace right at the water's edge. But in the year 365 AD, a tsunami devastated the coast of Alexandria. Cleopatra's royal palace was destroyed, and a huge part of the city was plunged into the sea. Some scholars think Cleopatra's tomb was on that strip of coastline, and that her remains have been lost underwater ever since. However, there is another popular theory. 30 miles from the heart of Alexandria is the ancient city of Taposiris Magna. At the edge of the city are two famous ruins. One is an old lighthouse dating back thousands of years. The other is the Temple of Osiris. It's within this temple where scholars say Cleopatra's body may have been buried. Archaeologists recently uncovered two mummies from the temple. These mummies were high-status individuals, covered entirely in gold leaf. It's believed they were priests from the days of Alexandria, and that Cleopatra's own body could be lost somewhere beneath the temple. The third theory is that Cleopatra was buried in a nondescript stone tomb on the Greek island of Rhodes. Given the toxic political climate at the time of her death in the year 30 BC, some experts suggest her body was taken away and buried in secret so that her grave would never be disturbed. Volcano Island. Scientists have recently made a terrifying discovery in Alaska. They identified a giant volcano bigger than anything imaginable. The volcano has been hiding in plain sight, disguised as a group of small volcanic islands. These are the Aleutian Islands, a group of 6 volcanoes off the coast of Alaska, making up a chain of small, mostly barren land masses. Each stratovolcano was assumed to be its own entity. There's Carlisle, Cleveland, Herbert, Tana, Uliag, and Kagamil. But what scientists recently figured out is that these are not individual islands or volcanoes. Instead, they are all interconnected through massive underground vents to form one huge and seriously destructive volcano. Scientists from the Carnegie Institution for Science in Washington believe the islands are connected to form a single caldera. In other words, the huge bowl-shaped mouth of a monster volcano. Researchers already know volcanoes can contain multiple vents, the holes from which smoke and gas and fire is spewed during an eruption. But this is unprecedented. The caldera is comparable only to the 3 overlapping calderas at Yellowstone National Park, which extend for about 45 miles to form a supervolcano. That would make the hidden volcano in Alaska a supervolcano as well, and capable of destroying the world. Inishkeel. The Irish island of Inishkeel has a fantastically dark history dating back centuries. The island itself is beautiful. with the Cerulean Sea stretching in all directions. The Atlantic wind is cold, but the views are glorious. And when the tide goes down, a shallow stretch of land allows access to the island from the coast. Like Moses when the Red Sea parted, you can walk right from the Irish mainland to the island. And there you can explore the ruins of a mysterious monastery from the 6th century. Nobody's sure when exactly the island of Inishkeel was abandoned, but it's believed it was around 1841. That was likely when the last community of rural farmers finally gave up and left for the mainland. But many years before that, 1,500 years before today, in the early era of Irish Christianity, Irish monks lived on the island. It's believed St. Colonial Skeletons arrived with a small group of followers and built themselves a church on the island. The church is still standing, albeit without a roof. But the story of this saint has a bit of a dark twist. Some historians say Colonial Skeletons had murdered his father and was ordered to atone for the crime of patricide. He didn't go to the island out of the goodness of his heart, but rather as a form of punishment. He stayed there for 7 years and died in the 590s. Big shout out to Randall Petrolgi and the Jansen Journal. Thanks so much for watching. If you are new here, welcome, and be sure to subscribe for more scary discoveries. The Phantom Island. The 15th century Venetian cartographer Zuan Pizzigano marked down the Antilia Island group on a map in 1424. The Antilia Islands is a mysterious group of islands off the coast of Portugal that no one has ever seen before. This mysterious map, called the Portolan Chart, was discovered in 1953 and is currently being held at the James Ford Bell Library at the University of Minnesota. The map itself shows Western Europe, Northwest Africa, and a huge part of the North Atlantic Ocean. It also shows the Madeira Islands, discovered by Portuguese sailors in 1419. It shows the Azores archipelago, but it also shows rectangular land masses right across from mainland Portugal. The islands across from Portugal are strange because they don't currently exist. Yet, according to legend, the main island of Antilia was settled when a group of Visigoth bishops fled mainland Europe after the Spanish conquest of 714. It was said that each bishop formed their very own settlement, and so the island became known as the Isle of Seven Cities. The legend was so popular that when Zuan Pizzigano made his map, he included the islands despite having never seen them. The cartographers in the following decades and centuries then copied his map and added the islands themselves. For centuries, these islands existed in the minds of the Portuguese. In November of 1475, King Alfonso V of Portugal even granted the Isle of Seven Cities to the famous knight Fernão Teles, assuming he could find it. The Island of the Druids. Anglesey Island is the largest island in Wales and the 7th biggest in the UK. In local Gaelic, it's called Inismán, and some have argued that the island may have been the real-life location for the mythical land of Avalon. Avalon first appears in historical literature in 1136. Geoffrey of Monmouth, the same writer who made King Arthur famous, wrote tales of Avalon that have survived all the way until now. He claimed Avalon was where the sword Excalibur was forged, and where King Arthur went to recover after he was wounded at the Battle of Camlan. The legendary island was supposedly ruled by Arthur's sister Morgan, who was something of a sorceress. There have been a lot of alleged locations for where Avalon may have really been, or at least its inspiration. Some say the former island of Glastonbury Tor, and some say Anglesey Island. But even if Anglesey Island wasn't a mythical place, it was occupied by Druids over 4,000 years ago. The island is dotted with mysterious Druid burials, with the crumbling remains of ancient Bronze Age ceremonial sites. The whole place is brimming with Celtic history, passage tombs, and old villages that go back to the days of Rome. The Lion of Kaa. The Lion of Kaa is an ancient sculpture on the Greek island of Kaa, located in the Cyclades. The lion is a rock sculpture carved from the bedrock of a hill. It's puzzled scholars and archaeologists for centuries because no one knows what it's doing there. The sculpture appears to be completely random. It's not accompanied by any other artifacts or statues, Nobody knows who sculpted it or what it was made to represent. This isn't a small statue either. The lion is huge, 26 feet long and 9 feet tall. It looks as though it grows out of the island itself, and looks an awful lot like a sphinx from ancient Egypt watching over the area. One of the theories is that the Lion of Kaa was made to commemorate a legend from Greek mythology. In Greek myth, the island of Kaa was originally inhabited by water nymphs who were so beautiful they made the gods jealous. Hating the nymphs for their beauty, the gods agreed to send a lion to destroy the island and chase the nymphs away. The stone lion that still stands may have been part of a temple built to commemorate the myth and celebrate the fact that the island was never completely destroyed. Lindisfarne Holy Island. Lindisfarne Island is one of the most historically rich islands in England. It was the site of the first Viking invasion. It has a deep religious history, and archaeologists have just found the oldest prayer beads in England on its shores. Archaeologists were digging at an ancient burial site on the island when they came across the necklace of prayer beads. According to the researchers from the University of Durham, the necklace was inside a man's grave. The beads were made from the vertebrae of salmon sometime in the 8th century AD. The salmon vertebrae is quite interesting because it shows how early Christian worshippers incorporated fish as a form of symbolism. Ever since the death of Christ, fish has been an emblem of Christianity. Finding such a unique Christian artifact on Lindisfarne is hardly a surprise. Lindisfarne is also known as the Holy Island because it's been a sanctuary for Christians starting in the 7th century. When England was still dominated by Anglo-Saxon culture, Christians sought refuge on the island so that they could pray to God in peace. They built a grand monastery in 635, a place where monks lived and worshipped in relative peace. Most of these old religious buildings are nothing but crumbling ruins today, but the whole island is covered in archaeological treasure. The island was also the first place the Vikings landed in British territory in the late 8th century. They pillaged the Christian sanctuaries and murdered all the monks. Santorini or Atlantis. Santorini, an island in Greece, was the home of the Minoan civilization 3,000 years ago. It was a great and mighty island with powerful cities, tall buildings, rich palaces, and advanced technology. But in the year 1650 BC, there was a volcanic eruption. The island was covered in 200 feet of ash, scorching away the Minoan people. All life was decimated, and the prosperous city-state was destroyed. Just around 1300 years later, the Greek philosopher and writer Plato described an island nation that once boasted a powerful military and a flourishing culture. This place was called Atlantis, and according to Plato, the gods destroyed the people for their arrogance, and they were plunged into the sea. Scientists believe Atlantis may have in reality been the island of Santorini. They say Atlantis was never plunged into the sea. Instead, Plato got his natural disasters mixed up. There was an island nation just like he described, a powerful city-state with a great navy and a strong economy from prosperous trading routes. But it wasn't a mythical race of people called Atlanteans. It was the Minoans on the island of Santorini. Their great civilization wasn't plunged into the sea, but drowned under a sea of ash from the volcano. Lost Temple of Hercules. Archaeologists in Spain recently used laser scanning technology to identify submerged ruins off the coast of the Bay of Cádiz. They found what experts have called one of the holy grails of archaeology. Francisco José García, an archaeologist from the University of Seville, called the discovery spectacular. Just under the water, experts discovered a huge structure about 1,000 feet long and 500 feet wide. The structure is an exact match to ancient descriptions of the mythical Temple of Hercules, which stood on top of an island 3,000 years ago. Ancient history tells us that the Temple of Hercules was built by the Phoenicians in the 9th century BC. They constructed the temple on the crest of a small island, and it was a monumental achievement. They chiseled the 12 labors of Hercules across the walls of the temple. It had an eternal flame kept forever burning by a dedicated priest, and it was a great pilgrimage site visited by Greeks and Romans alike. But then something must have happened. Researchers believe sometime after the 1st century AD, the water level rose. What had originally been an island was quickly swallowed by the sea, and the temple was lost. Archaeologists also discovered the remains of a harbor and a dock just south of the temple, proving that people had once docked their boats here.
Mysterious Babylonian Temple. The great city of Nippur was one of the very first in the world. It was built by the ancient Sumerians in the cradle of civilization, with the entire city being dedicated to the Sumerian god Enlil, the lord of the wind and ruler of the cosmos. The actual location of Nippur, meaning the ground the city was built upon, was occupied as far back as the prehistoric period by ancient people who lived in shanties and mud huts over 8,000 years ago. After a brief period of growth, the primitive humans who lived in mud huts began to build truly solid structures, and by 4,000 years ago, they were building temples dedicated to the gods they made up by looking at the sky. Not too long ago, archaeologists from the University of Chicago came across one of these temples in Nippur. But even though the city itself was dedicated to Enlil, this temple was made to honor a different god. In fact, it was built to honor a goddess, one named Gula. She was considered the goddess of healing. Back then, if people were dying or feeling sick, this is the goddess they would pray to. What that means is that 4,000 years ago, sick people in ancient Mesopotamia would have made their way to this temple, or one like it, to ask Gula to heal them. They believed the only way to be healed was to get on the good side of the healing goddess. Archaeologists found some rather strange figures in the ruins of the temple. One of the figures was of a man clutching his throat, clearly suffering from some kind of affliction. Another figurine showed a man holding his stomach. Nippur was placed on the tentative list under UNESCO's World Heritage Site in February of 2017. Maya chocolate. Near the coastal Mexican resort town of Playa del Carmen on the Yucatan Peninsula, something shocking was discovered inside a creepy cave. Researchers with Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History found a vessel partially submerged in the Cueva de la Cruz cenote. It was buried in the soft sediment and had been dumped there during the last rainy season when the cenote was flooded. The vessel is strange and remarkably well preserved, painted red and black, and shaped just like a pumpkin. But it's what the researchers discovered inside the vessel that makes the story so interesting. They were able to date it back to the pre-classic period of Mexico, between 300 BC and 250 AD. They were also able to look at trace elements left inside the vessel and to determine what it was used to hold. It was used for drinking chocolate. Somebody over 2,000 years ago had sat down with this pumpkin-shaped vessel in both hands and chugged hot liquid Maya chocolate. It was seasoned with roasted cacao seed paste, chili peppers, and cornmeal. The liquid chocolate then would have been transferred from one vessel into another repeatedly until the top became covered in a thick, yummy foam. The drink had likely been used in an official ceremony or some kind of religious ritual, maybe for medicinal purposes. We're guessing it tasted delicious, but it definitely was not sweet. The mirror afterlife. In Norway, archaeologists recently discovered the ancient grave of a Viking warrior. This Viking was buried 1,100 years ago, and a sword was placed at his left side. It's not unusual at all for a Viking to have been buried with a weapon, but the fact that it was put on his left side is a little strange. Normally, a Viking would be buried with their weapon on their right side. Archaeologists believe that by placing the sword on the opposite side, the dead warrior may have been left-handed, but that's not the most interesting part. According to Raymond Sauvage, the project manager, Vikings almost always buried their weapons on the opposite side that they were worn. So normally, a Viking had their sword fastened to their belt on the left side, but would have it buried on their right. Vikings believed that the afterlife was a mirror image of the real world, and so, in order to prepare them for the next adventure beyond death, all of their possessions were buried on opposite sides. Other than the sword, the warrior was discovered with a spear, an axe, and a shield. He was most definitely some kind of fierce fighter, since most Vikings in the Middle Ages were actually, contrary to popular belief, ordinary farmers. An ancient mine. A group of cavers explored deep into an old cobalt mine in Cheshire, England, that was abandoned around the year 1810. When they entered this dark and gloomy place, They had never expected to come across a small trove of artifacts. They found leather shoes over 200 years old, clay pipes that had once been used for smoking tobacco, and a mysterious inscription written in candle soot. The old cobalt mine is located near the city of Manchester. It was used in ancient times to add blue pigment to pottery and glass, and was a major export for England up until the 19th century. By the early 1800s, imports from other countries became cheaper, and the English mining industry went under. The people who went into the old mine were members of the Derbyshire Caving Club. Members of the club had been exploring the mine since the 1970s, but it was only recently that they came upon a previously unexplored part, and it was like walking straight into a time capsule. The old cavern was in almost pristine condition, as though the miners had left to take a lunch break and never came back. The cavers discovered a bowl buried in the wall, which they believe was something superstitious the miners did to thank the mine when it yielded good ore. But it was the inscription in the soot that really caught their attention. All that was written was the initials WS and the date August 20th, 1810. Seeing as 1810 was the year the mine shut down, this may have been one of the last miners to ever set foot in the chamber. But sadly, no one knows who WS may have been. Ancient copper crown. Kiln workers in India were busy digging for clay for the village of Chandayan when they came across a mysterious skeleton. The workers had been collecting clay to make bricks, and the last thing they had expected to find was a dead body. But this was no ordinary dead body. The skeleton had a crown fixed to its skull. The crown consisted of a copper strip decorated with a pair of copper leaves, and it had one massive red bead fixed to it. They also found some bowls, pots, and a clay ball that may have been used in a sling weapon. The Archaeological Survey of India was dispatched to investigate. They performed a real excavation and discovered more chunks of the skeleton, including a leg bone and pelvic bone. They also found another piece of the crown and more storage jars. And 65 feet away from the burial, the team came across a huge collection of animal bones. It looks as though the kiln workers had stumbled upon some kind of ancient ritual. Archaeologists don't know who this guy was, but feel like he may have belonged to the Indus Valley civilization around 1900 to 1600 BC. Whoever he may have been, he was important enough that he wore a splendid crown of glittering copper and bright red jewels. He was buried right near a whole herd of animals that had likely been slaughtered in his honor. Then again, researchers also say he could have just been an extravagant individual with a rich taste in jewelry. More giants of Sardinia. In Monte Prama, Italy, there are roughly 40 gigantic statues known as the Giants of Monte Prama. They date back 3,000 years and were first discovered on farmland back in the 1970s. The giants are, well, gigantic, and were shaped in many different forms. Some of the giants appear to be boxing, some are holding massive curved shields, and others appear to have been holding weapons before they crumbled to pieces and were buried by the naturally shifting earth. In 2022, a new pair of monumental statues were uncovered. These things once stood over 6 feet tall and were found at the necropolis at Cabras, in the same general area all the other statues were found. Unfortunately, both the statues were in pieces. In fact, they were so effectively destroyed that most people would have mistaken them for boulders. Chunks of heads, arms, and torsos were excavated from the dirt, and researchers also found traces of a road. This road seems to connect to over 170 tombs that were found being guarded by the giants of Monte Prama, but nobody's really sure what it was for. It almost appears to have been a funerary road, a grim boulevard traveling through a graveyard where curious giants stood like quiet sentinels watching over the dead. Bronze Age spearhead. Yet another interesting piece of the past was recently revealed in England. Excavations were being done at the Thames water sewage works in South Sardinia when researchers came across a variety of exceptionally old artifacts. I'm talking prehistoric, thousands and thousands of years old. The main discovery was a Bronze Age spearhead, but that was only the tip of the iceberg. The site of the sewage works itself lies over a multi-period archaeological landscape. In other words, a place that's been occupied repeatedly over the ages. Previous investigations already uncovered traces of human habitation going back to the Neolithic days, and stretching all the way into Roman times. They have found a Bronze Age settlement that was made from quaint wooden structures, as well as an old farm from the days of the Roman occupation. But the spearhead is something altogether new. The archaeologists with Cotswold Archaeology first identified a group of roundhouses dating back 3,000 years. Then they stumbled upon a pair of old Roman trackways, which may have been used for bringing soldiers through the country. And finally, the pristine spearhead, found at the surface of a shallow pit. It's an extremely rare artifact, and it's in remarkable condition. It was most likely a weapon belonging to a primitive tribesman in Britain, though we don't know for sure. Chanchan. There is an incredible little-known site in northern Peru. It's called Chanchan, and it was the ceremonial religious center for the Chimu civilization from between at least 850 AD and 1500 AD. The Chimu was a prosperous pre-Hispanic civilization that dominated the northern region of Peru before the rise of the Inca. They amassed great fortune, built gigantic cities of stone with wondrous monuments, and practiced a religion based around a sun deity. Their cities were so impressive that Chanchan was actually the largest primitive city known in the Americas prior to 1470. After the rise of the Inca Empire and the founding of the Spanish city of Trujillo in 1535, the Chimu began a slow decline to extinction. Their great city, rather than be respected by the invading Spanish, was looted and destroyed. Archaeologists have already discovered all kinds of beautiful temples and lost ruins, but recently they made a new, smaller discovery at the site of Chanchan. They came across a wooden figure that had been decorated with sheets of mother of pearl. The strange little figurine almost looks like a child's doll with black almond eyes, a pointy orange nose, and a triangular wooden loincloth. We don't really know what it was used for, perhaps in ritual ceremonies, maybe as a decoration, or maybe it was a child's toy. An Egyptian stroke victim. A team of researchers from New Jersey University were doing a detailed medical examination on an ancient Egyptian mummy, trying to learn about its life and death when they made a rather bizarre discovery. According to what the authors of the study wrote in their report, which was published in World Neurosurgery, the mummy was a woman. She lived in ancient Egypt and had suffered a stroke that left her seriously disabled. Her entire left hemisphere was paralyzed, and she had probably lived for years like that before dying of unknown causes. This was a remarkable find because until now, nobody has ever found an actual stroke victim from ancient Egypt or anywhere else in the ancient world. The closest was an 18th century Italian priest, and that was discovered in 2017. The Egyptian stroke victim lived 2,700 years ago, during the 25th dynasty of Egypt. She was between 25 and 40 and was buried on the west bank of the Nile River near Luxor. We don't really know anything about her personal life, only that she suffered a stroke at a very early age, and it may have been the result of a brain injury. The oldest European face. A team of Spanish archaeologists discovered the fossilized remains of one of our oldest ancestors. They discovered these ancient human bones deep in the Atapuerca Mountains in northern Spain. They were excavating a group of dark and spooky caves when they came across the fossilized face of a hominid that lived 1.4 million years ago. According to the scientists, this is now the oldest close human relative ever found in Europe. And here's where the discovery gets really interesting. Up until now, the first anatomically modern humans who arrived in Europe did so 50,000 years ago. There had never been any proof of humans in Europe a million years before today, and yet this fossilized face is very obviously human, or humanesque. This discovery is changing everything we know about history. At the same time that this oddly human-looking creature was wandering through Europe, the Homo habilis and other species of early humans were roaming through Africa with distinctly ape-like features. Until now, scientists didn't think human features existed for hundreds of thousands of more years, and definitely not in Europe. Whether this specimen represents a missing link between apes and humans is yet to be seen, but it's definitely a shocking discovery. It was only made in the summer of 2022, so we still need to wait and be patient to see what further analysis turns up.
Cleopatra and the Headless King. An incredibly rare discovery was made in Taposiris Magna in Egypt, and it could hint at the possible location of Cleopatra's legendary tomb. The gigantic headless statue of a mysterious Greek king was uncovered in the ruins of an Egyptian temple. Excavation leaders say the statue is potential evidence that the temple was once the resting place of both Queen Cleopatra and her lover, Mark Antony. The Temple of Osiris Magna is not on any major tourist map. It's located 28 miles from Alexandria, far from the pyramids and far from other major archaeological sites. For years, researchers have been poring over this temple, trying to uncover its ancient secrets. And now they have found a statue, 6 feet of solid black granite with no head. Researchers believe the statue is of King Ptolemy IV because his name was found near its base. According to National Geographic, he was one of the original Greek rulers who took over Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great. He was king between 221 and 204 BC. This was an exciting discovery because nobody has ever been able to find the tomb of Cleopatra, the last ruler of ancient Egypt. She and her Roman lover died after they were defeated by Caesar Augustus in 30 BC, but neither of their bodies have ever been recovered. Osiris Magna was an extremely busy temple around the time that Cleopatra died. Archaeologists have already found over 500 skeletons and 20 tombs here. It was a major place for burying important people. It could be that Cleopatra was discreetly buried in a crypt here, and that her mummy is still waiting to be found. Rare Roman statues. Archaeologists in England were excavating what they believed to be a tower from the days of the Anglo-Saxons when they came across 3 very rare statues. These statues are Roman, suggesting that the entire dig site was also Roman. The archaeologists came across 2 busts of a head and a torso, and the 3rd bust was just a head. Oddly enough, the 3 statues make up a small family as they were modeled after an adult female, an adult male, and a child. However, nobody has the slightest clue who in the world these people were. The team now believes the mysterious archaeological site was originally used as a graveyard in the Bronze Age. It then turned into a mausoleum after the Romans invaded Britain in 43 AD. Then, over 1,000 years later, in 1080 AD, it became a Norman church. These statues are now some of the rarest Roman artifacts ever found in the country, and the discovery was all thanks to an infrastructure project. Britain is in the middle of creating the HS2, a new railway system, and they've been digging up all kinds of ancient artifacts. Shortly before the Roman heads were found, the project revealed roughly 3,000 burials underneath an ancient Norman church. Every single corpse had to be moved and reburied to make room for the railway. Military headquarters. Buried underneath a perfectly ordinary cornfield in Serbia, archaeologists uncovered the remains of an ancient Roman military headquarters. It's a very rare discovery, especially given its random location. Archaeologists revealed what used to be known as a principium, the headquarters of a Roman legion. There are over 100 similar bases found across the ancient territory of the Roman Empire. However, archaeologist Miomir Korak says almost all of them are buried under modern cities. Finding one totally in the open like this is a huge opportunity to learn more about the Roman military. The compound was discovered near the capital of Belgrade, yet it was hidden a full 3 feet underneath the surface. This place had once been a massive military installation, but because of the shifting soils and rains from over the centuries, it was buried almost as deep as a modern grave. Archaeologists identified 40 rooms, each complete with a heated wall for comfort in the winter. They also found a treasury, parade grounds, and a shrine. In one of the rooms, the experts found a stash of silver coins. It's believed the coins were lost during an invasion. The headquarters itself belonged to the 7th Claudia Legion, a major division of the Roman forces, active between the 2nd and 5th centuries AD. Unfortunately, archaeologists have only uncovered about 4% of the site so far, but that 4% is already bigger than Central Park in New York. The first English. Archaeologists recently made a shocking discovery after they analyzed DNA from skeletons excavated across England. Researchers believe they have finally uncovered the very first groups of people who officially defined themselves as English. Researchers found that the first true English people likely descended from German, Danish, and Dutch people. They migrated to England from Europe, and over time became identified as English. What the team also found was that this group of early English people had a genetic connection to West Africa. What this seems to suggest is that in the Middle Ages, England was a diverse and complex civilization. This was a shocking discovery for many different reasons. It's very rare to get a glimpse at the ancient bloodlines of England, which was once the largest empire in the entire world. Only a century ago, in 1922, the British Empire was the biggest and most powerful empire the world had ever seen, with its territories taking up a quarter of the Earth's land. What we see thanks to the DNA of these 460 skeletons that were buried between 200 and 1300 AD is that the English did not live in small elite groups. The idea that medieval Englishmen lived in quiet villages may be entirely wrong. Many skeletons showed 33% DNA from West African ancestors. The point is that the first groups of English-speaking people in Britain were a mix of groups from Africa to the lands of the Vikings. Secrets of the Stone Tablet. Oggiocola is a mysterious site from the 6th century that was built by the Etruscans, the enigmatic civilization that predates the Romans in Italy. At this site, which is in modern Tuscany, archaeologists uncovered a mysterious stone slab known as a stele. It's over 2,500 years old, and it weighs about 500 pounds. The slab was inscribed in a language that hasn't been used in almost 3 millennia. Gregory Warden from the Southern Methodist University in Dallas believes the discovery of the stone slab is the most important Etruscan find in decades. He believes the huge slab of stone will provide invaluable information about the ancient sacred practices of the Etruscans. It might even help to decode their forgotten language. Right now, archaeologists are busy trying to decipher the inscription. So far, they have only revealed its first secret. They identified the engraved name of a fertility goddess called Uni. She was likely worshipped starting around 700 BC in northern and eastern Italy. Uni would have only fallen out of favor around 100 BC when the Etruscans were absorbed by the Roman Republic. Sadly, that's all we know at the moment. There are over 120 characters left on the stone slab, currently the longest Etruscan text known to science. Researchers are still struggling to decipher what the stone says, character by character. Ancient graffiti. On the wall of the great King David's tomb on Mount Zion in Israel, some graffiti has been found. The ancient graffiti bears the name of Knight Adrian von Bubenberg. It was discovered as part of the Israeli Antiquity Authority's research project to document the inscriptions of pilgrims left at the holy site throughout the Middle Ages. The team discovered 40 inscriptions belonging to Muslim and Christian pilgrims, many of them written in different languages. The tomb of King David, the same David from the Bible who fought against Goliath, has been a place of pilgrimage for centuries. During the Middle Ages, people would carve their names into the wall of the tomb, just like someone might carve their name onto a piece of Stonehenge today if given the chance. It was a way to leave a piece of themselves inside the tomb, and for Adrian von Bubenberg, it really worked. Historical records show he was born in 1424 in Switzerland and grew to be a national hero. He participated in military conquests across Europe, fought at the Battle of Murat, and was in the Burgundian Wars. Before he died in 1479, the knight made his pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He saw the tomb of David with his own eyes and then scratched his name on the wall to let everyone know he was there. Rare Roman mosaic. An extremely rare mosaic from the Roman era was recently found during the excavation of a building in Syria. It's been described as the most important archaeological discovery since this Syrian conflict began over a decade ago. The mosaic was uncovered in the town of Rastan, and it's absolutely huge. The artwork is 1,300 square feet and shows a rare portrayal of Amazonian warriors, a favorite from Roman mythology. The Amazonians were likely inspired by the legendary Scythian female warriors of the Eurasian steppes. They lived through Greek mythology, Roman mythology, and are still popular today. Wonder Woman, the comic book character, is also based on Amazonian warrior women. The huge mosaic also shows scenes from the legendary Trojan War as described by Homer, as well as other fantastic scenes. The mosaic shows Hercules slaying Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. It also shows Neptune, the Roman god of the sea, and his 40 mistresses. Unfortunately, archaeologists aren't sure what the building originally was. It may have been a public bathhouse, but nobody knows for sure. The mysterious building dates back to the 4th century AD, when Syria was under Roman rule. This may have been the floor that Romans walked upon as they traveled back and forth from the public baths. Colonial Skeletons. Archaeologists in Peru recently uncovered the terrifying remains of 3 kids and 5 adults. These skeletons were found at a colonial-era cemetery in Lima, the modern capital of Peru. It came as a huge shock because shortly before, archaeologists found 500-year-old Spanish corpses riddled with syphilis at a different colonial graveyard in Lima. To understand these discoveries, we need to go back to the founding of the city. Lima was officially founded in 1535 by Francisco Pizarro, only 3 years after the first conquistadors arrived in Peru. It became the Spanish capital, and to this day, it's the capital of the nation. But before that, the Lima culture and the Ixma people lived in the region for 2,000 years. When the Spanish showed up, the place was covered in stone temples, great plazas, and many beautiful cultural sites. Sadly, most of them were destroyed, and many of them were built over by churches and Spanish buildings, but some of them are preserved within the Maranga Archaeological Complex. It was within this complex where the archaeologists discovered the 8 colonial skeletons. These human remains are a major discovery because they were likely part of a forced mass conversion of indigenous locals to Catholicism. The Spanish brutally forced the native people to convert to their religion after invading their home. One of these skeletons was found with a wooden cross in their hand. All 8 of them were buried facing east to west, which was the typical Christian way of being buried. This was because Catholics believed Christ will come from the east when he returns, and that the remains of Christians will want to witness the second coming for themselves from their graves. The Minatogawa Man. At the Minatogawa limestone quarry in Japan, located on the southern tip of Okinawa, some of the oldest prehistoric people in the country were discovered. The human remains were found by local amateur archaeologist Seiho Oyama. He noticed there were fossilized bone fragments trapped within building blocks that he purchased from the quarry. Between 1968 and 1974, a total of 4 skeletons were unearthed there. They date between 30,000 and 20,000 years old, and are currently among the oldest hominids ever identified in Japan. They are known collectively as the Minatogawa specimens. When it comes to prehistoric hominids, these skeletons are as rare as you can get. No additional specimens have ever been found, making these ones entirely unique. So, what do we know about these ancient Japanese ancestors? These skeletons likely belong to a forgotten prehistoric population that lived on the island of Okinawa. They were noted to be abnormally short, about 4 feet 6 inches tall. They were also found to be distinctly different from the prehistoric Jomon people who lived across Japan from 16,000 to 2,000 years ago. The Jomon are considered the predecessors of modern Japanese people. What this means is that the Jomon likely migrated here from somewhere else. They possibly came from East Asia, invaded Japan, and conquered the more primitive hominids living on the island. It was like modern humans moving into Europe and destroying the Neanderthals. Soldiers' remains. 245 years ago, there was an epic battle fought at the Red Bank Battlefield Park in New Jersey. It was one of the greatest victories of the American Revolution. It happened on October 22, 1777. American soldiers battling for their independence fought against Hessian soldiers who were fighting on behalf of the British Crown. The Hessians had about 2,000 men, but the Americans only had 500 soldiers. By the time the battle was finished, 377 Hessians had died, and only 14 Americans were killed. It was a major upset, and the victory kept the British in the north. The inferior colonial army had survived. Later that year, the fort at Red Bank was abandoned and subsequently destroyed. However, in 2022, archaeologists from Rowan University decided to start digging. The biggest find at the site was a 1766 King George III gold guinea, although there were several bones that were discovered as well. Extremely rare skeletal remains of 13 human beings were found on the grounds of the battlefield. While not yet confirmed, researchers believe the bones belonged to Hessian soldiers who had spent almost 250 years buried 4 feet under the earth. The archaeologists accidentally broke into a mass grave, complete with femurs, teeth, and ghoulish skulls.
Hidden desert tombs. Archaeologists in Iran recently came across a lost burial mound in Tepe Nakarechi. They had been searching for a place called the Seleucid Laodicea Temple underneath the town of Navahand. Instead of finding the ruins of the temple, they came across a hollow burial mound where a high-ranking individual was buried thousands of years ago. They just don't know who because nobody was found inside the tomb. The town of Navahand may look like any ordinary Iranian town today, but it was much more impressive and spectacular about 2,300 years ago. It was a major town during the reign of King Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire in the 3rd century BC. He ruled over Syria and Iran, which at the time were all part of the Greek state called Seleucid. Back in 1943, archaeologists doing excavations here discovered a huge inscription with 30 lines of ancient Greek. The inscription was calling for the people of the city to obey all the laws of the new Hellenistic government. The inscription also mentioned the existence of the Laodicea temple built by King Antiochus for his wife, Queen Laodicea. However, this mysterious temple remains lost to this very day because no archaeologist has ever been able to find it. And when researchers tried to find it recently, they ended up discovering an empty burial mound with nobody inside. Demon traps. Sardis is an extremely old city in Turkey, going back thousands of years. It's most famous because in the year 17 AD, the entire ancient city was devastated by a horrifying earthquake. The earthquake struck in the middle of the night, tore down all the buildings in the city, and it took them years to rebuild. When they did rebuild, they used charms and magic seals to prevent an earthquake from ever destroying their great city again. About a decade ago, in 2013, archaeologists were excavating some of these ancient buildings in Sardis. Specifically, they were looking at buildings that had been put back together following the earthquake. What they discovered were strange containers holding a variety of bizarre items. Each clay container had inside of it bronze tools, at least one eggshell, and a single coin. These peculiar objects would have been used 2,000 years ago in ancient rituals, specifically rituals to keep evil forces at bay. Archaeologists say this is a rare example of just how psychologically damaged the people in the city were who experienced the earthquake. They were so terrified that they created demon traps and then buried them under the foundations of their homes, hoping to catch any wicked entities before they could cause harm. According to archaeologist Elizabeth Raubold, the citizens of Sardis were burying strange things underneath their floors even before the earthquake. For example, archaeologists have found jars with puppy skeletons inside. It shows just how paranoid the Romans were and how obsessed they were with curses and spells. The Lost Pyramid of Noah's Ark. A fragment from the Dead Sea Scrolls has revealed something rather shocking. It turns out that Noah's Ark may not have been what we all think it was. The ancient text, which dates back 2,000 years, could be proof that Noah's Ark was actually a pyramid. Here's a quick recap of the Dead Sea Scrolls. 50 years ago, a Bedouin shepherd in Israel accidentally discovered a cave filled with ancient scrolls near the Dead Sea. They became known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, a collection of about 800 manuscripts. Around 200 of those manuscripts are bits and pieces from the Hebrew Bible. Just recently, the Israel Antiquities Authority scanned tens of thousands of tiny fragments of the scrolls using a special camera. Each fragment was photographed 28 times and in different light wavelengths. All this fancy photography has allowed researchers to decipher texts that had been previously illegible. One of these new texts, according to researcher Dr. Alexei Yuditsky, describes Noah's Ark as having its ribs gathered at a point at the top to form the shape of a pyramid. This is interesting because it's not the only historical mention of the Ark being a pyramid. A Greek translation of the Bible from the 3rd century described the Ark as pyramid-shaped, while medieval authors even said the Ark's roof was pointed. This has led some to speculate that the Ark may have actually been a pyramid, and that it could still be hiding somewhere in the ancient world, possibly in Egypt or Turkey. We just don't know where, or if the rumor is even true. Lost Hellenistic City. Basania was a city in the Illyrian kingdom that would ultimately be captured by Rome and subdued under their control. Historians have always known about the city because it was described in Roman texts 2,000 years ago by the Roman historian Livius. He wrote that Basania was where the Illyrians took one of their final stands against the Roman army, even though they fell anyway. But it wasn't until 2018 that this lost city was finally discovered. It was researchers from the University of Warsaw who first identified the massive defensive walls of Basania. The walls were found on a forested hill near the city of Shkodra in Albania. Before researchers came, the locals had always assumed the stones were natural formations. They were actually the walls of a massive city that once dominated the region. Once archaeologists started digging, they found all kinds of things. They found a gatehouse, a pair of bastions, and the remains of the entire settlement. Based on where it was discovered, Basania was sandwiched between two of the most important centers in Illyria. It was between Shkodër, the Illyrian capital, and the major Greek city of Lissos. While the city isn't that extraordinary, especially since the whole thing has been leveled by time and neglect, it does have a deep history. During excavations, ancient fragments of pottery dating back over 4,000 years were found. That means that people lived here all the way from around 2000 BC until the Illyrians were defeated in the 2nd century BC. Big shout out to Mary Cook and Dar Golds. Thanks so much for watching and supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and join the Origins Explained family. The Lost Cities of the Amazon. A most fantastic discovery of lost cities has just been made in South America. Scientists in Bolivia have discovered evidence of sophisticated cultures living deep in the Amazon. They used highly sophisticated mapping technology to pierce the jungle canopy and map the floor. What they discovered was evidence of an ancient urban sprawl hidden in the wilderness. This isn't the lost city of Z or El Dorado. Instead, scientists identified multiple settlements making up a larger community of people, all connected by roads and byways. It's a kind of urban stronghold and socially complex center that was most likely occupied by the Kasarabe culture from between 500 and 1400 AD. These settlements had pyramids, great temple compounds for ritual activities, and even water distribution systems that stretched for miles across the landscape. These systems delivered fresh water to people in these smaller, more rural settlements. This is pretty amazing because it shows that at least in Bolivia, the Amazon was hardly just a wild place. Instead, the native inhabitants had carved their own world out of the jungle and changed the landscape to suit their needs. The only thing is that these settlements were abandoned abruptly about 600 years ago, even before the Spanish showed up. Right now, nobody has any idea why. The altar on Mount Eal. In the book of Joshua, which can be found in the Bible, there is a story about how he built a great altar of stones where the Israelites went to make peace offerings. As it turns out, that altar may have been a real place, because in the 1980s, archaeologist Adam Zertal conducted a land survey around Mount Eal and discovered an anomaly about 450 feet beneath the peak. That anomaly proved to be the remains of an ancient altar. The mountain was excavated in the 1980s, and the full scope of the altar was uncovered. Somebody had built a massive offering table from unhewn stones, way back in the Iron Age. The base was built right into the bedrock, with a depression in the middle where the researchers found charred animal bones and ash. These bones were almost definitely from sacrifices. In total, the monumental altar was about 30 feet long, standing over 10 feet tall, and with a huge ramp leading to it up the mountainside. Nobody knows who built the altar for sure, but it does seem connected to the story of Joshua in the Bible. It could very well have been the actual altar built by Joshua. Offerings of the Templo Mayor. Thousands of strange and somewhat creepy wooden objects have been discovered inside the ancient Templo Mayor of the Aztec. The Templo Mayor is at the very heart of the ancient Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. The city is currently half buried underneath the modern structures of Mexico City, pretty much paved over by the Spanish. However, there are some pieces still remaining. The Templo Mayor is one of them, although it's broken and in seriously rough shape. Construction on the temple began around the year 1325. Less than 200 years later, in 1521, it was absolutely destroyed by the Spanish. The modern archaeological site can be found right in the main plaza of Mexico City, at the core of the historical district. In the Nahuatl language, the temple is called Hueyteocalli, and it was dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the Aztec god of war, and Tlaloc, the Aztec god of rain and agriculture. Researchers have uncovered over 2,500 wooden objects from underneath the ruined temple. Things like disturbing ceremonial masks, headdresses, scepters, figurines, earrings, and a bunch of other amazing artifacts. These things had likely been dumped in the bowels of the temple by Aztec priests as offerings to the gods. The only reason the wooden objects have survived for so long is the incredible humidity underground and the condition of the soil. A mysterious burial site at Kelenderis. At the ancient city of Kelenderis, located on the Mediterranean coast of Turkey, archaeologists have uncovered a lost infant burial site. Not just that, but also a furnace that had been used for commercial production. The port city of Kelenderis was established roughly 2,800 years ago. It's believed it was occupied by the Phoenicians first around the 8th century BC, then the Samans. It was eventually taken over by Rome around the 1st century. They invested heavily in infrastructure, and the Byzantines took over until it was captured by the Armenians in the 11th century, and then captured by the Turks in the 13th century, and it has remained with the Turks ever since. Excavations have been going on since 1987, and every year there are more and more discoveries. Over 150 tombs have been found thus far, and yet none of the tombs contained burial gifts. None except for the newly discovered infant burial site, which was positively bursting with artifacts. Researchers uncovered glass bracelets, inscribed ceramics, and much more. Even stranger is that the infants were all buried around a central child's grave, and researchers don't know why. The other interesting discovery at this little-known piece of lost Rome is the furnace. Researchers say it's about 1,300 years old and was used specifically for producing roof tiles. The lost city under the Grand Canyon. There might just be a lost city hiding underneath the Grand Canyon. 1,486 feet down the canyon wall, there is supposedly a cave opening which leads down into the city. However, legend has it that there are no other ways into the city, only the single entrance hidden somewhere on one of the canyon walls, perhaps even already caved in and invisible, thereby sealing the city from daylight forever. This may sound like total nonsense, but there is evidence of such a thing dating all the way back to the early 20th century. There is an article in the Arizona Gazette dated April 1909 in which a man named G.E. Kincaid supposedly discovered the very entrance to the city under the Grand Canyon. He had been traveling the Colorado River by boat looking for minerals when he accidentally found the entrance leading to the subterranean cave. What he found inside is unbelievable. He described huge granaries, storehouses made from hard cement, dining halls, gray metal that looked like platinum, and a network of tunnels leading deeper into the earth. The place was so big it could have housed at least 50,000 people, and there were weird carvings on the walls that looked an awful lot like hieroglyphics. Some experts have suggested the city was built by the Egyptians, but that's hard to believe. In reality, if this underground city does exist, it was probably occupied by a Native American group. Mysterious Ethiopian Church. In the dry and dusty highlands of Ethiopia, a team of archaeologists have uncovered the oldest Christian church anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa. This discovery is shining light on one of the world's first Christian kingdoms, and also one of its most mysterious. The team of international scientists found the church about 30 miles from Aksum, a modern city, but also once the ancient capital of the Aksumite Empire. This empire appeared around the 1st century AD and dominated most of Eastern Africa and even Western Arabia. The church was dated back to the 4th century AD, 300 years after Christ's supposed death and resurrection. While that may seem like a long time, it was about how long it took for Christianity to catch on. It was in the 4th century when Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity for the first time, then converted to a Christian on his deathbed in the year 337. The presence of this church shows that Christianity arrived in Ethiopia and took hold before the rest of the world. Even when the Aksumite kingdom began to lose its power in the 8th century, and as Islam spread across the entire region and took over pretty much everywhere, they remained defiantly Christian. Ethiopia managed to stay Christian even in the 16th century, when the Somali and Ottoman armies tried to take the highlands. And today, Most Ethiopians still belong to the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church.
The Island of the Lepers. Spinalonga is a small and barren island of barely 85 acres in Greece. And although the island is small and appears to be completely empty, that's not the case. Preserved on this mysterious island is a dark and daunting past. In fact, locals call it the Island of the Lepers. The history of the island starts around 1526, when Spinalonga wasn't an island at all. It was part of the peninsula of Elunda, but the land was shattered to create an island. The Venetians wished to create a fortification that could defend the port city of Olus. Due to the natural salt flats nearby, Olus was suddenly a very wealthy city with high commercial value. The Venetians maintained control over the island until 1715, and for those short 200 years, Spinalonga was one of the most powerful sea fortresses anywhere in the world. But then the Ottomans showed up and conquered the small island. The Turks then had control of it until 1903, which was when it was returned to Greece. But then came the leper community. Hidden among the ruins of the medieval fortress are the lost bones of lepers shunned from society. Between 1903 and 1957, Spinalonga was used to house people afflicted with leprosy. It was one of the final active leper colonies in Europe, with an estimated 400 lepers living on it at one time during the 60-year outbreak. It might make for a neat story now, but it was absolutely horrific. During its early years as a leper colony, the island had no infrastructure. People were sent there to literally wait for death. There was no running water, no food, and nothing but the harsh sun and bitter seawater. People were even misdiagnosed and sent to Spinalonga for suffering minor afflictions like rashes. Nobody wanted to take their chances with this disease. Philae Temple. The small island of Philae in Egypt is less than 450 feet wide, and yet it's been capturing the imagination of travelers for thousands of years. It was once called the Pearl of Egypt and was known across the Mediterranean for its tall palm trees, lush green plants, and marvelous temples. It's on this mysterious island where colonnades and sanctuaries once dominated the skyline, giving all those who visited an intriguing sense of mystery. These days, the temples have mostly been repaired, but some are still in ruins. Regardless, the island of Philae is a major tourist destination. The island was the center for the cult of Isis starting around 664 BC. The descendants of Ptolemy, Alexander the Great's general who took control of Egypt following his death in the 4th century BC, built more temples later on. They wanted to please the Egyptians, which in turn helped them secure their rule over the region. They did this by building temples dedicated to the locals' favorite gods and goddesses. The temple to Osiris was built on the nearby island of Bige, and Horus had his own temple on Philae. The island also had a temple to Imhotep, the revered architect of Pharaoh Dozer's step pyramid in Saqqara, whom the Egyptians later deified as a god of medicine. Ancient Greek sailors. New archaeological evidence is suggesting that primitive humans took to the seas much earlier than previously thought. It might seem impressive that early people paddled their boats to somewhere like the Channel Islands 13,000 years ago. But what this new discovery suggests is that people were already doing that 450,000 years ago in the Aegean Sea. However, they weren't technically Homo sapiens. Instead, scientists from the University of Patras in Greece say they were members of a different hominin species called Homo erectus. The primitive hominins figured out how to make boats nearly 500,000 years ago. Then they used them to travel throughout the Aegean Islands between Greece and Turkey. The evidence is based on multiple discoveries made in the Aegean Islands. Archaeologists uncovered prehistoric tools that match perfectly with tools created by the Homo erectus. Scientists refer to them as part of the Achillean tool industry, which was invented by the Homo erectus almost 2 million years ago. There's only two possible explanations for how the tools ended up on the Greek islands. It's possible that the islands may have been part of the mainland, meaning the water level was significantly lower. But if that's not the case, the ape-like hominins must have carved boats with their stone tools and sailed to the islands themselves. What do you think about that? big shout out to Tajuik Khan for the super thanks. This is so helpful for us to keep making more videos and creating more fun things for everybody, so big thank you. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and join us for more videos about mysterious discoveries and strange history. Earthquake Island. A devastating earthquake rocked the coast of Pakistan in 2013. When that happened, an island made entirely of mud rose up from the waters as a new landmass. Then, after just 6 years, the mysterious earthquake island suddenly vanished. The earthquake of 2013 was joined by the eruption of a mud volcano. When the Arabian tectonic plate rubbed itself against the Eurasian plate, intense pressure caused buried mud to liquefy and bubble to the surface. The mud moved so quickly it carried rocks and boulders with it like an upside-down avalanche. All these rocks ended up on the surface, forming a 65-foot-tall island, measuring 295 feet wide and 130 feet long. Scientists named it Zalzala Ko, which translates to Earthquake Mountain in the Urdu language. The earthquake that created the island was catastrophic, resulting in over 320 deaths and displacing thousands of people. Absolutely nothing good came of it except the new island, which scientists found fascinating. But now, according to NASA, the whole thing is gone. Satellite images show the material that made up the island eroded so quickly that it started to shrink immediately after it was created. Now, Zalzala Ko is a thing of the past, but it's a great example of just how quickly things on this turbulent planet can change. Suakin Island Ruins. On the island of Suakin in Sudan, there are the remains of an abandoned city built entirely from coral. For an amazing 3,000 years, the port city was a strategic tool for powerful empires. Because the island of Suakin was situated in northern Sudan on the tip of the Red Sea, it was the perfect place to transport goods to Africa and Arabia. The islanders here made a fortune, and Suakin quickly developed into a wealthy island port. And amazingly, everything in this city was built using coral from the local sea and other parts of the world. The port city was originally founded by none other than Egyptian pharaoh Ramses III in the 10th century BC. It was a faraway base the Egyptians used for trading and exploration. Over 1,000 years later, the island was occupied by Islamic followers that decided to leave the Hijaz region of Saudi Arabia. It soon became an important outlet for Africans on their way to Mecca. The mysterious island city continued to evolve and prosper, bringing great wealth to the various rulers of Sudan. One king from ancient legends supposedly had 360 wives and lived in a grand palace somewhere inside the city. Suakin was apparently one of the most majestic cities in the early medieval world. Every building was made from colorful coral, and walls were decorated with stone carvings and fancy wood. But in the 19th century, things took a turn for the worse. The island became a hub for the slave trade in eastern Africa and soon fell into disrepair. By the 1920s, there was very little trade left, and the coral buildings had disintegrated. Today, only the ruins of a magnificent city still exist, but the port still serves ferries on their way to the Saudi coast, and it continues to provide access between the continents for pilgrims who complete the Hajj every year. The Channel Islands. During investigations in the Channel Islands National Park, archaeologists discovered a new Native American site. Workers with the National Park Service were conducting routine monitoring on Santa Rosa Island off the coast of California when they made this shocking find. As you may already know, the Channel Islands make up one of the most important ancient sites in North America. Researchers believe humans migrated to the remote islands between 8,000 and 13,000 years ago. That's based on previous discoveries of early human Paleolithic activity. According to John Erlandson from the University of Oregon, the mysterious settlement appears to be 10,000 years old. Scientists believe a group of people migrated from Northeast Asia to the Americas, making them some of the first residents of the New World, and eventually they made their home on Santa Rosa Island. This new discovery is nothing short of amazing. Archaeologists uncovered stone tools and early examples of hunting and fishing technology. These tools were wielded by the earliest ancestors of North America's indigenous people. These hunters rested and relaxed on the balmy California island thousands of years before any major civilization even existed. Giant fossilized tree. A giant fossilized tree has been found by researchers with the Museum of Natural History in Greece. On the picturesque island of Lesbos, museum workers dug up an ancient tree complete with its branches and roots. The rather unusual discovery is rare, so rare in fact that nothing like it has been found in almost 3 decades. The tree was discovered in a petrified forest on the island, one of the most densely populated places in the world for fossilized tree trunks. Researchers believe the petrified forest was formed following a string of volcanic eruptions that occurred around 20 million years ago. A huge portion of the island was covered in lava and ash, and much of the vegetation became preserved. It's a truly amazing place because millions of years ago, plant life in the Mediterranean was very different than it is today. The petrified plants found here are vastly different from modern vegetation. And while there's been a lot of logs and plant fossils found, an entire tree is practically unheard of. Nikos Zoros, the director of the museum, says that every part of the tree is still covered in fine volcanic materials. Unfortunately, that's all we know right now. Researchers need a bit more time to do chemical analysis before they can determine the species of the tree and any other interesting details. Plymouth. In 1997, the Caribbean island of Montserrat was covered in ash and lava. It was a catastrophic event that saw 2/3 of the island blanketed in volcanic debris. The areas that were affected became exclusion zones, and the ancient town of Plymouth is now a modern-day Pompeii. The Soufriere Hills volcano erupted suddenly and violently after being dormant for centuries. Prior to the eruption, Montserrat was home to many celebrities' favorite resorts. There were many nice places stretching out from Plymouth along the beautiful tropical coastline, but in 1989, Hurricane Hugo decimated Plymouth and the luxury resorts. And then the volcano exploded, leaving everything in ruins. Plymouth is now a half-buried disaster, resembling the victim of an atomic bomb. Nobody is allowed to go there, and you can only look at the town from outside the exclusion zone using binoculars. The town of Plymouth was apparently established at the very base of the volcano, suggesting that its original founders weren't thinking much about future eruptions. So much volcanic ash rained down on the city that the courthouse was buried all the way up to its ceiling. The most recent eruption was in 2013, so it's unlikely that humans will be allowed back into Plymouth anytime soon. Stolen human remains. Mysterious human remains are hidden inside metal cabinets in the warehouse of a museum that belongs to the Smithsonian Institution. These remains were uncovered from burial sites on the remote Aleutian Islands almost a century ago. After spending nearly 10 decades as specimens in a museum, the human remains will be transported back to the island to be buried by its current inhabitants. According to Crystal Dushkin, the mayor of the village of Atka, those remains belong to her ancestors. The small village of Atka only has about 70 residents, which isn't surprising given its isolation. After all, the Aleutian Islands are situated between the eastern edge of Russia and the Alaskan mainland. These islands are home to some extremely ancient sites and have been occupied by people for an estimated 9,000 years, though not continuously. The indigenous islanders were forced from their villages by the Russians in the 1700s, and then again in World War II by the Japanese. The Smithsonian Museum has about 175 specimens stolen from burials across 11 islands. The looting took place in the 1930s when this guy showed up and started taking bones from graves. He made some pretty big contributions to the world of archaeology, but his grave robbing hasn't given him the best reputation. The good news is that after all these years, the remains of their ancestors will hopefully be returned to their original graves. The Labyrinth of the Minotaur. There is a disused stone quarry on the mysterious Greek island of Crete with an elaborate system of subterranean tunnels. Archaeologists are now saying these tunnels could be the original labyrinth from the Greek myth of Theseus and the Minotaur. According to Greek legend, the wife of the Minoan king Minos gave birth to a gruesome creature that was half man and half bull. The monster was called the Minotaur. It was such an abhorrent beast that the king locked it in a grand labyrinth near his palace. Every few years, the king fed the Minotaur sacrifices of young men and women from Greece. Then the hero Theseus finally cut its head off. The question is, how real is this myth? According to a team of scholars, the labyrinth may have really existed. We already know the ruins of the palace at Knossos likely belonged to King Minos. But now, the discovery of a cave complex and subterranean tunnels appears to prove a labyrinth existed on the island as well. There hasn't been any proof of a Minotaur yet, and it's not likely that there will be, but it does look like there truly was a labyrinth. The purpose of it, however, is still unknown. Thanks for watching! Which of these amazing islands would you like to visit the most? Let me know in the comments below. Personally, it's Crete for me. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time. Bye!